When you serve dinner to your family tonight, do you plan on sending them a bill?
Oh, wow. I mean, could you imagine?
Right. Just think about it for a second. Like, when you put a plate of mashed potatoes down in front of your kids, do you actually calculate the market value of those potatoes?
Like factoring in the cost of the butter and the milk.
Yeah, the butter, the salt, the utility cost of the stove, and then, factoring in the cost of your culinary labor.
Yeah.
Adding a reasonable profit margin for the overhead of the kitchen.
Naturally, you have to cover your overhead.
Exactly. And then handing a fully itemized invoice to your 7-year-old.
Yeah.
I mean, do you charge your kids rent based on their current earning power? Or maybe their future market potential?
Obviously not. I mean, that sounds completely absurd.
It really does. It sounds like a dystopian comedy sketch, honestly. But according to the source material we are unpacking today, which is this really fascinating essay titled Domestic Socialism and the Market Contradiction, this simple, everyday act of not charging your kids for dinner makes you an active participant in a highly complex, hidden economic system.
It really does reframe the whole thing.
It completely flips it. We are deep diving into a text today that argues there is this intense, almost exhausting cognitive dissonance we all maintain the absolute second we step outside our front doors.
Right, and that contradiction reveals something pretty profound about how society fundamentally assigns human worth.
Exactly. And just to set this stage for you, the listener, I want to be really clear up front.
Hmm.
Because the author uses highly charged terms like domestic socialism and dives into critiques of how macro markets function, our goal today isn't to debate whether this framework is politically right or wrong.
No, not at all. We aren't here to advocate for a specific economic policy.
Right. We are just impartial guides here. We want to map out the architecture of the author's logic. We want to understand how they view the kitchen table as this, like, macroeconomic microcosm.
And trace that argument all the way from the family dinner to global inequality.
Yeah. We're just looking at the blueprints of this essay to understand how the author constructs this worldview. So where does this blueprint actually start?
Well, the foundation of it starts with a really radical reframing of something so mundane we rarely even think of it in economic terms at all, which is the family unit.
Right, the family.
Yeah. The author kicks off the argument by stripping away all that sentimental, romanticized language we usually use to describe parenting and family life, and they replace it with cold, hard economic terminology.
Which I found really jarring at first, but also incredibly
Oh,
effective.
it is jarring because we're so used to talking about families in terms of love and duty.
Yeah, biological imperative. We kind of mysticize it, right? We just say, well, we're a family. That's just what we do.
Exactly. But the author forces us to look at the household as a literal economy, like a system of resource generation, allocation, and consumption.
And when you view it through that specific lens, the text argues that almost everyone runs their household on the exact same principles of cooperative sharing.
And they go a step further and give this dynamic a very specific label. They call it a micro-level form of socialism.
Which is a heavy phrase to drop.
It is a heavy phrase, but they explicitly state that family life rarely, if ever, operates like a free market transaction. Instead, resources within the home are pooled.
Pooled and distributed, right?
Right. They're distributed according to absolute need rather than individual earning power or market value.
Let's really pause and examine the mechanics of that for a second, because it fundamentally violates the rules of the market economy we live in outside the home.
Oh, completely. It's the total opposite.
Right, because in a standard market transaction, distribution is based on exchange value. Like if I want a television, I have to provide capital equivalent to the value of that television.
The store doesn't care if you need a television to watch the news.
Right. They only care if I have the purchasing power. But the author points out that the moment you cross the threshold into your home, that entire logic is inverted.
Think about the ultimate dependent in a household, like a newborn baby.
Oh, yeah. That's the perfect example.
A newborn has zero earning power. They produce zero capital. They cannot offer any goods or services in exchange for what they consume.
None. They're just a giant drain on resources.
That's exactly. In a strict free market system, an entity that consumes massive resources while producing zero capital would be deemed a catastrophic liability.
It would be allowed to fail, bankrupt immediately.
Right, it would be dissolved. Yet, in the home, the newborn receives a massively disproportionate share of the household's resources.
Yeah, they command the time, the money, the physical labor,
And the emotional energy of the highest earners in that microeconomy.
and the adults eagerly provide it. That's the crazy part. They don't view it as a bad investment. They view it as the entire point of the enterprise.
Which means the distribution of resources is based entirely on the infant's absolute undeniable need, not their ability to contribute to the household GDP.
It's as if the household is this highly functioning miniature welfare state operating flawlessly.
It is, and the author highlights this to expose a baseline behavioral truth about humans. What is particularly compelling, I think, is how the text deliberately strips away a political identity to make this point.
Yeah, I noticed that. The author explicitly notes that whether someone identifies as a staunch conservative Republican who, advocates for deregulation and free markets.
Or a liberal Democrat who advocates for social safety nets.
Right. They both run their dinner tables in essentially the exact same cooperative, needs-based manner.
I find it really fascinating that the author highlights both Republicans and Democrats doing this, because why focus so heavily on the political labels of the parents if the whole point is just what happens at the dinner table?
Because by invoking those opposing political labels, the author is demonstrating that our ideological posturing outside the home is it's completely overridden by our behavioral instincts inside the home.
Oh, I see. So it's like a baseline instinct.
Exactly. The text suggests that when humans are left to their own devices, within a community that they actually care about, they naturally default to cooperative sharing. They do not default to cutthroat market competition.
Right. The conservative parent doesn't means test their toddler before putting a Band-Aid on a scraped knee.
Imagine if we actually did that. Imagine a 5-year-old comes up to you and says they're freezing. And you just say, well, I'd love to get you a new winter coat, but let's look at your earning power this quarter.
You've been slacking on your chores.
Yeah, you only did 2 chores this week. The market value of you picking up your Legos just doesn't quite cover a Columbia snow jacket.
So you're just going to have to freeze.
Freeze until you figure out how to increase your personal productivity and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, kiddo.
Sounds completely sociopathic when you say it out loud.
It really does. And the fact that we instantly recognize it as sociopathic is the author's primary piece of evidence.
Because we implicitly understand that market dynamics are wildly inappropriate in that setting.
Yeah, they're destructive when applied to the people we value most.
Yeah.
We recognize that needs-based distribution is just the superior moral and practical framework for sustaining human life.
Which completely upends the narratives we're constantly fed about human nature, doesn't it?
Oh, totally. We hear all the time that humans are naturally competitive.
Yeah.
That it's a dog-eat-dog world.
Survival of the fittest. The
Guilty.
only law of nature.
Right. But the author is saying, look at your own living room. The empirical evidence of your own daily life completely contradicts the narrative that we are inherently selfish, transaction-oriented creatures.
Because the adults go out, they endure the friction of the competitive market to earn capital. But the moment that capital crosses the front door,
It enters a communal pool. It transitions from my money to our resources.
the transformation of that capital is key to the whole argument. It is deployed to ensure the survival and flourishing of the whole collective unit.
Prioritizing the weakest and most vulnerable members first.
Exactly. The author is asking us to recognize this not just as some biological quirk of parenting, but as a legitimate, highly successful economic model that we practice universally.
But that brings up a really big question. If we all operate this way at home, and it works, if it is legally the only way a human family can survive, why don't we call it by its name?
Right.
If millions of people are practicing a micro-level form of socialism every single night, why is there such a massive cultural disconnect?
Well, the author argues this disconnect is deeply rooted in the power of language, specifically how certain terminology has been intentionally warped in our public discourse.
Oh, Tao.
The text suggests that society actively, almost aggressively, avoids naming this household dynamic for what it actually is, because the vocabulary required to describe it has been rendered politically radioactive.
Radioactive. That's an
Yeah.
interesting way to put it. The author uses a very specific phrase here, too. They say the label socialism gets weaponized and flattened.
Yes, flattened.
I really want to dig into that concept of flattening. How does the author define that mechanism?
So flattening is a crucial concept in understanding how political discourse manipulates our perception. To flatten a complex theoretical concept means to violently compress it.
Like stripping away all its nuance.
Exactly. You strip away the spectrum, the historical variations, until you are left with a two-dimensional, easily digestible caricature.
A cartoon version of the real thing.
Right. And the author argues that in modern public discourse, the entire spectrum of cooperative economics has been flattened into a singular, terrifying stand-in for authoritarian regimes.
Or like the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. So it loses all its theoretical definitions about shared ownership or community pooling of resources.
Or needs-based distribution, which we were just talking about.
Right. And it just becomes a terrifying synonym for gulags or breadlines or state surveillance.
The text explicitly states that this flattening happens not because the fundamental dictionary definition of cooperative sharing is inherently flawed, right?
Correct. It happens because of what the word has been forced to represent in the cultural consciousness. The word has been hijacked by its absolute worst historical manifestations.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of anyone listening who might be feeling a little skeptical of the author's premise.
Sure, it's a controversial point.
Because the author claims this word is merely weaponized and flattened into a stand-in for the Soviet collapse. But isn't it entirely reasonable and, frankly, necessary for people to avoid a word that has historically been attached to such massive, undeniable geopolitical trauma?
It's a very fair question.
I mean, millions of people suffered and died under centralized authoritarian regimes that proudly use that exact word to describe themselves. So isn't the author being a bit incredibly dismissive by just waving that away as linguistic baggage?
That is a very natural reaction, and it represents a major hurdle in the author's argument. However, if you do a really close reading of the text, it shows the author isn't actually denying the horrific history of those authoritarian regimes.
So they aren't engaging in historical revisionism.
No, not at all. They aren't claiming that the Soviet collapse didn't happen or that the trauma wasn't real.
Okay, so they acknowledge the macro-historical trauma is a real thing.
They do, but they are pointing to what they call a profound tragedy of language.
A tragedy of language. What does that mean, practically?
The author's precise distinction is that the catastrophic failures of massive, centralized, authoritarian nation-states have effectively banned us from using accurate vocabulary to describe the harmless, highly beneficial cooperation happening in our own living rooms.
Ah, I see. So it's like a linguistic casualty of the Cold War.
Exactly. The geopolitical conflict essentially poisoned the well of language we need for our private lives.
Wow. The author is highlighting the dark irony of the situation.
Right, because the word has been so thoroughly attached to historical trauma at the macro state level, we are essentially forbidden from using it at the micro level.
We lack the permitted vocabulary to accurately describe how we feed our own children. Because a totalitarian dictator on the other side of the world 70 years ago misused the vocabulary to mask a dictatorship.
It's wild when you put it like that.
The consequences of that are actually staggering when you think about it.
Right.
Because if you don't have the words to describe a reality, it makes it incredibly difficult to defend that reality.
Or to expand it.
Exactly. So instead of saying, I run my home on a micro-socialist principle of pooled resources and needs-based distribution, we just throw our hands up and say, well, we're a family, and family takes care of family.
And by retreating to that romanticized language, the author argues we strip the behavior of its structural economic significance.
We mysticize it.
Right. We mysticize the family as this magical biological exception to the real rules of economics, rather than acknowledging that the family is, in itself, an immensely successful economic system operating on cooperative principles.
We make it about an intangible feeling of love, rather than the very tangible act of resource distribution.
Which, obviously, it is about love.
Oh, of course. But the author is pointing out that the physical manifestation of that love is an economic model, needs-based resource distribution.
Right. If you love someone, you don't charge them for a glass of water.
You just don't. But if we can't name that model, if we are culturally prohibited from acknowledging that cooperative economics is the foundation of human survival at the micro level, what happens when we leave the house?
Well, that's the big question.
If this invisible wall at our front door is forcing us to switch vocabularies, it must be forcing us to switch behaviors too.
It forces a total paradigm shift. And this brings us right to the core of the essay's title, the market contradiction.
The market contradiction, let's unpack that.
The author argues that because we cannot name our private cooperative reality, we are forced to submit to a completely different, often opposing public reality.
At home, people willingly pool resources and distribute care for the collective good.
But the text points out that the absolute moment we step outside, society demands strict adherence to competitive market norms.
The sheer cognitive dissonance of this is overwhelming once you map it out. We literally switch our moral and behavioral operating systems twice a day.
Every single day.
You wake up, you are operating in a cooperative, needs-based welfare state. You make your kids breakfast, you don't charge them.
Right.
Then you walk out your front door, you commute to work, and suddenly you are in a hyper-competitive, transaction-oriented gladiator arena where your entire worth is determined by your market output.
And then you clock out, come home, and switch right back to being a cooperative provider.
It is akin to living in a world governed by two completely contradictory sets of physics.
That's a great analogy. It really is.
Imagine if gravity worked one way in your living room. Like objects gently float toward each other in a supportive, cooperative cluster to ensure nothing falls and breaks.
A nice, safe environment.
Exactly. But the absolute second you step onto the sidewalk outside your house, the physics reverse, and everything violently repels everything else. And you have to fight just to keep your feet on the ground.
It sounds exhausting.
It does. How much subconscious mental energy does society expend, forcing us to pretend these two opposing moral frameworks aren't constantly grinding against each other every single day?
The psychological toll of maintaining that partition must be immense. It requires a daily compartmentalization of our deepest moral instincts.
And the text argues that this massive cultural contradiction is tolerable only if it remains unnamed.
Tolerable only if it remains unnamed. That is such a fascinating assertion.
Let's extrapolate on the psychology of that silence for a minute. Why does speaking the contradiction out loud break the spell? What is so dangerous about acknowledging the dissonance?
Well, naming the contradiction forces a structural reckoning.
A reckoning. How so?
If we admit out loud and in public discourse that we actively utilize a cooperative, non-market system for the people we value most in the entire world, our children, our aging parents, our spouses, what does that imply about the competitive market system we use for everyone else?
Oh, it implies that the free market is not the ultimate universal measure of human worth that it claims to be.
It goes even further than that. By naming it, we are confessing that the free market is actually a secondary and perhaps inherently flawed or inadequate system for organizing human life.
Wow. So it implies that when it truly matters, when human lives, health, and profound flourishing are on the line, we instinctively reject market principles as cruel and inefficient.
Exactly. And that is the existential threat to the dominant narrative.
If the free market was truly the most perfect, efficient, and deeply moral way to distribute resources, as strict macroeconomic theories suggest, then we would enthusiastically apply it to our families.
We would. We would charge our kids for dinner to teach them efficiency.
We would let the 5-year-old freeze if they couldn't afford a coat, because that would be the correct, efficient market outcome.
But we don't.
The undeniable fact that we are repulsed by that idea proves we don't actually believe the market is the highest moral good.
You know, author suggests that the dominant cultural narrative, the idea that your fundamental worth as a human being is inextricably tied to your economic output, your earning power, and your market value, is a really fragile construct.
It is. It collapses completely if the public collectively realizes they already run their most cherished institutions on a completely contradictory principle.
So this invisible wall at your front door isn't just a quirky social habit.
It is a highly guarded philosophical border. Inside the wall, human worth is intrinsic. You matter because you exist and you are part of the family.
But outside the wall, human worth is transactional. You matter only as much as you can produce.
And we just blindly accept this schizophrenia because to question it would require us to look at the entire macroeconomic structure of society and say, wait a minute, why are we treating strangers with a cruelty we would never accept in our own homes?
It is a deeply disruptive question. And the author does not shy away from that disruption. They push the argument out of the realm of personal psychology and directly into the structural design of society as a whole.
They really scale it up.
They do. The text argues that this exhausting cognitive dissonance, this invisible wall, is not an accident of modern life. It is structurally necessary to maintain the current macroeconomic order.
Okay, as we transition into the author's critique of the macroeconomic system, I want to clarify how we are approaching this. Just a quick reminder for you listening, we are tracing the causal chain the author is laying out here.
Right, analyzing the mechanics.
Exactly. The text claims that this dissonance is not accidental. and that silencing the narrative of cooperative sharing actively facilitates a macroeconomic system that frequently tilts against the working class and the poor. But I'm struggling to see how a lack of vocabulary at home actually changes tax policy or labor laws. What is the precise causal link there? How do they connect those dots?
Okay, the causal link operates through the mechanism of cultural consensus and political justification. Let's trace the author's logic step by step.
Okay, walk me through.
If society were to fully publicly acknowledge that human beings naturally thrive on pooled resources and needs-based distribution.
If we accepted that as our true baseline state.
Right, because we see it operating flawlessly in millions of homes. If we accepted that, then it would be extremely difficult for policymakers to morally justify a macroeconomic system that leaves the poorest and most vulnerable behind.
Oh, because the public would look at systemic poverty and say, wait, that's not how human beings treat people they value.
Exactly.
We don't let our kids starve when they can't earn capital. Why are we letting our neighbors starve? The moral justification for extreme inequality would just evaporate.
That is precisely the author's point. If the family dynamic is acknowledged as the true reflection of human nature, then harsh market inequalities look unnatural. They look structural and cruel.
But if the system can successfully deny our cooperative nature,
If it can flatten the language,
right, keep the invisible wall intact, and convince the populace that human beings are fundamentally competitive, selfish, and transaction-oriented.
then it provides the ultimate philosophical cover needed to maintain those inequalities.
Wow. So denying the kitchen table reality is essentially a massive PR campaign for systemic inequality.
It provides the foundational justification for a lack of social safety nets.
If politicians and corporate leaders can convince us that the competitive market is the only natural human state, then poverty isn't viewed as a systemic failure of cooperation. It is merely viewed as an individual's personal failure to compete.
It allows the system to individualize systemic failure.
Right. If human nature is a gladiator arena, then the person who loses the fight only has themselves to blame.
But the author's phrasing that this denial is not accidental warrants careful examination.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to challenge that specific phrasing. Not accidental sounds incredibly conspiratorial.
It does sound like that.
Is the author implying there is a smoky back room full of billionaires and politicians deliberately deciding to ban the word socialism? Like suppressing the concept of family cooperation just so they can keep wages low and cut welfare?
Or are they describing something more organic?
Yeah, exactly.
Within sociological and economic critiques like this one, it is vital to distinguish between a literal conspiracy and what is known as systemic logic.
Systemic logic.
Right. The author is not proposing a secret cabal of cartoon villains meeting in a volcano lair. They are describing a systemic self-preservation mechanism.
How does systemic logic function in this context, then?
Well, systems naturally evolve to protect their core operating premises. Think about a macroeconomic system that is fundamentally based on intense competition, capital accumulation, and wage labor. It will naturally select for, fund, and amplify narratives that validate competition and capital accumulation.
That makes sense. It feeds what sustains it.
Conversely, it will naturally marginalize, defund, or suppress narratives like the immense success of domestic cooperative sharing that threaten its core premise.
Oh, I see. It's like an immune system response.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
The market economy detects the concept of needs-based distribution as a virus that could rewrite its foundational code. So the system deploys cultural antibodies,
Like flattening the vocabulary.
flattening the vocabulary, amplifying competitive narratives in media, and creating immense cognitive dissonance, all just to neutralize the threat and protect the host.
It doesn't require a conspiracy. It just requires a system acting in its own blind structural self-interest.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the author's argument. The systemic silencing of our cooperative nature is the actual mechanism by which the system maintains its tilt against the working class.
Because if you cannot name the alternative, you can't fight for it.
Right. If you cannot point to your own home as proof that humans are capable of massive needs-based cooperation, then you cannot effectively advocate for those principles in public policy. You lose the philosophical battle before it even begins.
This paints a fairly bleak picture of how our public discourse is manipulated, though.
Very bleak. So if the system is so effective at denying our cooperative nature and maintaining this invisible wall, what is the countermeasure? What fundamental truth does the author want us to recognize to break this cognitive dissonance?
The countermeasure is rooted in forcing a complete redefinition of what we consider to be empirical reality.
Empirical reality.
The author concludes the essay by asserting that basic human cooperation, empathy, and shared responsibility are not utopian abstractions. They are rather observable facts.
The contrast there between utopian abstractions and observable facts feels like the linchpin of the entire essay. Let's unpack the utopian abstraction side of it first.
Let's do it.
In traditional mainstream economic discussions, when someone brings up empathy or shared responsibility or the idea of ensuring everyone has enough based purely on human need, how is that usually received by the prevailing economic establishment?
Oh, historically. Mainstream macroeconomic theory particularly models based on Homo economicus. The concept of the purely rational, self-interested actor treats empathy as a massive inconvenience.
An inconvenience.
Yeah. It is usually dismissed as an unstable, unreliable variable. It is treated like a nice, warm and fuzzy fairy tale that sounds wonderful in theory, but cannot possibly bear the weight of structural economic design.
That's not how the real world works, is the standard dismissal.
Exactly. Empathy is framed as a utopian abstraction, completely disconnected from the hard math of human survival.
The author, however, completely inverts that premise by pointing directly back to the kitchen table we started at. They are saying that empathy and needs-based distribution aren't pipe dreams we have to invent.
No, they are observable, daily, functional, operational facts.
The author provides the empirical evidence that mainstream economics ignores. Millions of households run flawlessly on empathy every single day.
It is not a theoretical model. It is the most widely practiced, enduring economic system on the entire planet.
The family unit survives solely because empathy acts as an economic engine.
It's treating empathy as a measurable scientific force, like thermodynamics.
Right. The author is saying empathy isn't a magical spell we're hoping to conjure one day to fix society. It's the actual mechanical engine currently keeping the foundational unit of our civilization running.
Humans sacrifice sleep, money, career advancement, and personal comfort for their dependents without expecting any financial return on investment.
Empathy is the baseline fact. So if we can observe this engine working so perfectly in millions of homes across all demographics and political affiliations, why is the broader macroeconomic structure so terrified of acknowledging it as a valid metric of human organization?
Because of the massive implications of that acknowledgement. Recognizing empathy as an observable, highly functional economic fact directly challenges the premise that markets are the only honest, effective measure of worth.
It threatens the monopoly of the market narrative.
Big time. If we accept that humans are deeply, fundamentally capable of large-scale cooperation based on need, because we literally prove it every single day in our homes, then the entire foundational justification for a ruthless, winner-take-all market system completely crumbles.
The market can no longer justify its harsh outcomes by claiming we have to organize society this way because human nature is inherently selfish.
Right. The home provides the undeniable proof that human nature is profoundly cooperative.
The text suggests that the greatest threat to massive systemic economic inequality isn't necessarily a dense new academic economic theory.
The greatest threat is simply the sudden, widespread cultural realization that we already know how to take care of each other.
We already possess the moral framework and the operational capacity for needs-based distribution.
And we already practice it every day, just on a geographically smaller scale behind our front doors.
We just have to realize that the skills we use at 6 p.m. in our dining rooms are entirely applicable at 9 a.m. in our boardrooms and voting booths.
It's just a matter of scale.
Let's synthesize the journey the author has taken us on today, because the causal chain here is truly remarkable. We started with the incredibly mundane act of feeding our kids mashed potatoes without handing them an itemized invoice.
We examined how that simple act represents a highly functional microeconomy of needs-based distribution, practiced universally regardless of whether a family identifies as conservative or liberal.
Right. Then we explored the tragedy of language, how the vocabulary needed to describe that cooperative reality has been weaponized and flattened by historical trauma.
Leaving us unable to articulate our own daily goodness.
We analyzed the invisible wall at the front door, the intense cognitive dissonance of switching from a cooperative moral framework at home to a competitive market framework in public.
And the psychological exhaustion of maintaining that contradiction.
We traced the systemic logic of how this dissonance provides the necessary philosophical cover from macroeconomic systems to individualize poverty, tilt against the working class, and maintain structural inequality.
And finally, we arrived at the author's profound conclusion.
That empathy and cooperative sharing are not naive utopian dreams, but the observable, daily, empirical facts of human existence, actively threatening the narrative that markets alone must define human worth.
It is a completely different lens through which to view the world around us.
It really is. It shifts the burden of proof away from those asking for cooperation and places it squarely on those demanding endless competition.
Exactly.
And it brings me right back to the hook we started with, the dinner table, the front door. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. A way to test this theory in your own life tomorrow morning.
Think about that invisible wall at your front door.
We've established that inside the wall, you operate on a baseline of empathy and needs-based distribution. Outside the wall, you are pressured to submit to ruthless market competition and view everyone as a transactional node.
But what if you consciously chose not to switch your operating system when you walked outside?
If we actually started valuing outside labor with the exact same needs-based empathy we instinctively use at home, how would that fundamentally change the way you interact with the world tomorrow?
Would it change how you look at the barista who pours your coffee, realizing their intrinsic human worth isn't defined by the $3 you handed them for a transaction?
Would it change how you view the delivery driver dropping off your packages in the rain or the teacher grading papers late at night? Are we capable as a species of extending the boundaries of our family just a few inches further out the front door?
Can we push that invisible wall back slowly until the cooperative principles of the kitchen table begin to infect the competitive logic of the sidewalk?
It's actually something to think about the next time you sit down to serve dinner.